So welcome to our fifth lecture in historical linguistics, and it's a special pleasure to welcome Professor Claudine Moulin from Trier, who has been my role model for the last 30 years, or even more, because I started studying at Bamberg when she was just doing really exciting research, and she included us students in looking at the materiality of text, so while studying historical linguistics, and it was a real revelation for me. So the first seminar I did with her was on Der Ackermann von Böhm and studying early New High German, and we were allowed to go into the Staatsbibliothek and look at the first printed edition of Der Ackermann and do our Proseminararbeit transcribing the text and finding syntactical features and punctuation. And at the same time, she did an exhibition there on early modern printed grammars and textbooks. And this really has set me on a path. And she actually, like Haas and Eagle, she was already in Oxford when I first visited, because she was working there on something that Louise Morawetz is also very interested in, scratch glosses. And I remember, Claudine, seeing you in Duke Humphrey with a quartz lamp, leaning over the parchment manuscripts, looking for these signs of the boys scribbling or scratching in the margin with their stylus. And then also you were already there with digital humanities, so inviting me over to Trier for conferences on with a virtuelles scriptorium St. Matthias. So it's wonderful to be able to invite you back to a place where I try to combine these approaches, and I very much hope that soon it will be possible to have a proper high table dinner together. But until now, we are at least possible to converse about topics dear to both our hearts. And over to you for the lecture on Standardization of Written German, Dictionaries, Grammars, Language Guides.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think I'll start my presentation and then I'll say a few words of thanks. So I hope you see what I see now. Is everything okay?
Yes, perfect.
So yes, thank you, Henrike, for your invitation. I'm quite thrilled and also very happy about being here with you and with your students. And it is, in fact, it has been a long path, and we have a long common history. And I always think really back to Bamberg and the time we had there with lots of feeling of happiness and also of discovery. And I'm so happy that you're in Oxford now. So in fact, you've already said it, the grammars of German and the old grammars of German have accompanied my path, my career path since almost 35 years, and it's a very great pleasure to talk about them today. And today I would like to have a little other look on these grammars. And I chosen a part of the subject, the grammatization of the German language in the context of European language history, and also in the context of a socio-pragmatic approach to language history. So I would like to get started with you. Here you have the outline with the concept of grammatization of European vernaculars in the Renaissance and early modern times, and then we will have a look at two backgrounds of many backgrounds, the Latin tradition and the concept of urbanization, and what do grammars have to do with cities and towns in early modern times and in the Renaissance. And then we'll have a closer look at the German language and at the grammars and dictionaries and other sorts of linguistic treatises between the 15th and 17th century. And I've just taken a few examples just also to illustrate the thesis that I will be developing in the course of this lecture. And at the end, I would just like to talk to you about further research and give you some ideas of what to do with not a million of pictures, but with hundreds of grammars. Yes, so let's start with the context and the contextualization of the grammatization of European vernaculars in the Renaissance and in the early modern times. In fact, what I'm presenting to you now is in the spirit of what Peter von Polenz called soziopragmatische Sprachgeschichte. Peter von Polenz, the predecessor in Trier, who has founded this discipline in historical linguistics. So external factors are the key points in linguistic history. And for our times, I'm just going to give you the buzzwords, and we will have a look at them closer in the course of this talk. Urbanization, humanism, printing, Reformation, and literacy. All these do influence the rise of vernacular writing cultures in Europe in the Renaissance and early modern times. So my concept of linguistic history is, and the linguistic history of the German language, is that you cannot, yes, discuss or analyze the history of a language without looking at the neighbor languages. And so we have the history of the German language as part of European linguistic history. And of course, the history of grammatical theory, which is called grammaticography, is profoundly anchored in societal history. That is the history of the speakers and their cultural, societal, political, religious backgrounds, just to name a few. And so historical linguistics is a state of mind of interdisciplinarity. We have an interaction with other disciplines, and we have to, yes, live this interaction in a profound sort of way. For example, with history, book history, theology, literary history, and art history. I do think that this is something that Henrike is also practicing in Oxford with you. So let's get started with a few definitional preliminaries. What is grammatization? It is not to be mixed up with grammaticalization. And grammatization is a term coined by the French historian of language Sylvain Auroux in his Histoire des idées linguistiques, and then later on also in his book La révolution technologique de la grammatisation. Grammatization is, you have the French definition on this slide. I give you the English translation, leads to the description and development of a language on the basis of two technologies, which are still today the pillars of our metalinguistic knowledge, the grammar and the dictionary. So these two technologies, writing grammars and doing dictionaries or writing dictionaries, are the two founding elements of the grammatization of languages. It does, and I hope you can see the big picture of this chart. I will give you a zoom in the next slide, is that he looks at the history of the grammatization of European vernaculars, and he sees some common points. So now you have a timeline here. The time scale goes from the first Irish grammars in the about 650 of our times in the left corner, and then you see the red arrow with the time with the languages, and the green one with the time scale from 650 to 1900, but you should be able to go to the 21st century too. And we see that this time scale goes from Irish in 650 to present times. The last language he recorded was the Mordvik language in the 19th century, who developed grammars in 1838, for example. But this, you could add the Luxembourgish language in the 19th century as the youngest Germanic language, which also started developing dictionaries and grammars in the 19th century, and then became, in the course of time, a language for itself. If we have a look at this map, we will see that French, Italian, Spanish, German, Dutch, and English all developed their first grammars and also dictionaries in the 15th and 16th century. And here Sylvain Auroux makes a very interesting observation, which is that this coming out of the grammars and dictionaries, especially in printed form, is profoundly linked to the Renaissance times. He writes, and this time I'll quote the French, and you can read the English if you wish. La grammatisation des langues est un phénomène qui n'est ni unique, ni dans son origine, ni dans son existence. C'est son ampleur à partir de la Renaissance européenne qui est unique et en fait un processus irréversible sur le long terme. So he looks at the Renaissance time and he says this is the game changer for the for the upcoming of grammar and dictionary writing for these European vernaculars. In order to understand what happens at the Renaissance time, we have to have a look at the extra linguistic features. And this is something I would like to do with you in the further slides. But before we do this, and I think this is maybe also an interesting observation, Auroux turns our attention to the fact that the 16th century grammars are not alone on the game or on the choreography of vernacular treatises. We have also other treatises that are in the Latin tradition and that are translated, for example, in the vernacular languages in Europe, like logic treatises or rhetoric treatises, etc. So here you see a chart showing the coming up of the grammars in the 16th century and then on logic treatises, and he observes that these all seem to be happening at the same time. So, starting from this, I would like to go to my second point and to have a closer look at the two backgrounds I've already mentioned. On the one hand, the Latin tradition, and on the other hand, the phenomenon of urbanization. If we have a look at the Latin tradition, and this is the picture you see left in the slide of the Tübinger Hausbuch, you see the seven liberal arts, with the grammar, with the crown on its head, on a head in the middle, and from left to right, geometry, logics, arithmetics, then grammar in the middle, and then music, physics, and rhetorics. So this is the tradition that is the background of also writing grammar in vernacular times, and up till today, we still have patterns of the Latin meta linguistic descriptions that play into the description of our modern grammars today. Just think about the categories or the temporal categories of the different vernaculars in English, in German, or in French, also in modern grammars. And on the left hand, we see the late medieval town, and we will be having a look in what is happening in this town also in a few slides' time. So let's come back to the Latin tradition. Of course, we have a long tradition of bilingual teaching in the Latin context. Already in the monasteries of the early medieval times, we cannot imagine a teaching of Latin texts. For most of them are Latin. We don't have a lot of Greek texts at that time, but the teaching of the Latin text and the reading of the Latin text is not a monolingual matter. We have traces in form of glosses that, in fact, the monks and the nuns will be also treating and handling these Latin texts in their respective vernaculars. So here you see an example of the grammar Latin from the Donatus Maior, a manuscript of the 8th and 9th centuries, which contains Old High German interlinear glosses. So you have the tradition of a bilingual teaching methods going back to early modern ages. And it is true that there is this rumor going on that Charlemagne, or already had the idea of writing a grammar of Old High German, also of grammatization of the Old High German languages. What I want to say in this context also is that, in fact, if we have a look at the longue durée, we will observe, among others, an educational shift from the monastery in the early modern time, early medieval times, to the town in the late medieval and early modern times. So there is a shift of writing culture that will be taking place, and which in fact is also now the bridge to our idea of urbanization. So both factors are also linked to each other. So on the background that bilingual teaching is something that is not new but has a long tradition, it is interesting to observe that there is a shift being made in the type of alphabetization strategies in and through times. In the late medieval time and in the early modern time and in the Renaissance, we can observe that the alphabetization of pupils is made in the vernacular, as a prerequisite, a door opener for education in Latin and in education in the Septem Artes Liberales in the late medieval times. So we have I brought you this wonderful woodcut of the allegorical figure of the Grammatica, which in the one hand is holding a key in her left hand, and on the right hand a alphabet board in her hands that she is showing to a pupil who is wanting and willing to get in to the tower of knowledge and the tower of Latinity. But in order to get in, and he is coming from the town, which is in the background of this woodcut, he has to know the written language culture. That is, he has to be alphabetized and he has to be able to read and write in the vernacular. This is the prerequisite in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages and in the Renaissance times to get into this tower. And we know that the grammar is the source and origin of all arts. And so in order to get past this grammar, you have to know to write in your mother tongue and read in your mother tongue. So let's have a further look at this woodcut, because I think this is very, very interesting, and it shows the necessity of linguist and historian of the language to work together with art historians and also with other types of medialities as the printed text. The illustrations tell us oft a lot more, and also a lot of other interesting things. So if we come back to the fact that our pupil in the left of the picture has been alphabetized in the town in the back of this picture, we have an intramuros phenomenon of vernacular alphabetization, and then an extramuros phenomenon in the tower outside of the town where the Latin education is situated. We have the tower, of course, as a metaphor of vertical ascension to knowledge. Knowledge is good and good is high, and in order to, go up into life and to, you build up a career, you have to climb up this tower. And we are pretty sure that the bilingual teaching, as we know it from the our manuscripts of the Old High German town, is also a part of life in the lower part of the tower. But in order to be alphabetized and to get into this tower, you have to be able to write and you have to be able to read. And so intramuros, there's a lot of things going on. And some of these things are making and writing vernacular grammars by teachers and schoolmasters who will be active in the fact that they want to educate their pupils to get into this tower. So let's have a look at the town and what a role grammars might play in the phenomenon of urbanity. So we are going intramuros now. Just to give you a few of the, dates or data or background knowledge, we have an emancipation process of the vernacular that is going on in the also with the towns together from the 11th century onwards. This has to do with the importance and growths of cities or towns, the fact that we have urban citizens and wealthy urban citizens, and hand in hand with this we have new groups of educated people, respective people of persons needing written, that is vernacular culture, not Latin written culture, for example merchants, municipal administrations, but also lay people with a high level of education for which there will be books written in the vernacular. So this is an important factor because there will be a new, if you want to know, a new group of people wanting to read and write, not only in the monasteries, but outside the monasteries in the town. And there is something that we have to keep in mind, because today these four practices are like in one pot, but in the fact they're totally different practices. That is that speaking, reading, listening, and writing are four different things, and that you're able to speak without reading, but you might not even be able to write. But so these four things, you have to keep them apart when you look at vernacular grammars in the Renaissance and early modern times. If we look at the importance of the town for the vernacular written cultures, we cannot not have a look at the concept developed in the field of history, not linguistic history. The concept is coming from the historians, the concept of pragmatic literacy. I quote Hagen Keller, who is one of the founding fathers of this conceptualization. Alle Formen des Gebrauchs von Schrift, what is pragmatic literacy, is alle Formen des Gebrauchs von Schrift und Texten, die unmittelbar zweckhaftem Handeln dienen oder die menschliches Tun durch die Bereitstellung von Wissen anleiten wollen. So this is a very large definition. But if we take this definition and have a look at the textual genres of urban literacy, we see that a whole bunch of textual genres emerge, like archival documentation, accounting book, trading documents, town chronicles, written correspondences, etc., but also private literacy like devotional literature, entertainment, cooking book, etc. And all these are written in the vernacular. And among these, we have very special grammar books and orthographic treatises that cannot be conceived without the concept of urban pragmatic literacy. I'll just give you an example in the further slides. So we have a new group of persons working professionally with languages in the town, like professional scribes and town clerks that will also be playing a role in the beginning of the history of the German grammar, for example. And of course, we have the early letterpress printing, which is a profound urban phenomenon. It was discovered or developed in a town, in the town of Mainz, and not in a monastery somewhere in the woods. That is very important, and it is interesting that the first French grammars, in fact, were written by a printer, whereas for the German grammars, we have no grammars or orthographic treatises written by printers, which is a very interesting cultural phenomenon. And a further very, very important factor of the 16th century is, of course, the Reformation. And the Reformation is, of course, also an urban phenomenon. I always tell my students, if Martin Luther had been born somewhere in the south of Bavaria and had stayed there with speaking a Bavarian dialect, I don't know which the outcomes of the Reformations would have been, but Luther was a profound urban person. And so this is also a phenomenon that we should not underjudge or not forget when talking about grammars in the 16th century. Of course, we have with Luther the theological premises for written culture and the idea of an individual access to the Bible, and of course, literacy as an act of independent, theologically founded judgment. So in order to be a good Reformed Protestant, you should be able to read and write. And this is, in fact, one of the backgrounds of the vernacular grammars in the 16th century in Germany, where you will also not only have these theological reasoning in the grammars, in their prefaces, for example, but also the grammars will be printed together with catechisms, for example. And Luther also already as in his lifetime will become a linguistic model. But coming back to the urban context and the grammars and treatises, there's one other factor that we should not forget. Literacy goes hand in hand with numeracy in the town, because there's a large group of people that will have to count and have to write in a proper manner. And so it does not really surprise that we have treatises that will be combining both types of literacy. And here you have a counting book, Neu Rechenbüchlein, where the both competences are subject of the title Schreibrecht, Legrecht, Greifrecht, Sprichrecht, Schreib und Sprich, so kommt allzeit dein Fazit recht. So here in Wittenberg, the Reformation town, we have this mathematical treatise for beginners, let's say. And as I've mentioned, the people teaching mathematics and teaching orthography and grammar could be one and the same person. Here I brought an example of such a treatise, Heino Lambeck's Deutsche Orthographia. Lambeck tells us on his title page that he is Schrift- und Rechenmeister, that he is Schreib- und Rechenmeister. You have this, I choose this print also because it is a print in Low German. And so we see that Low German is playing a role in the vernacular grammar teaching and also in the grammatization of the German language. And we should not be forgetting that German has two façons d'exister, high and low German. Interesting is by Heino Lambeck is that the further editions of this book will be printed in High German. So early New High German are not in Niederdeutsch. So he will be making a switch, which is pretty parallel to the fact that in the 17th century, Low German will be losing its importance also for the goal audience of these books, namely the merchants, and the disappearing of the importance of the Hanse in Germany at that time. So once again, you see the importance of doing historical linguistics in a interdisciplinary way, and also in a way where cultural history plays a role. We would not be able to understand the language switch in these prints if we do not know about the society and the people living in the North Germany at that time. Let's have a closer look at the grammatization of the German language. For the 16th century, and you can remember Sylvain Auroux's big overview where he had as a first German important grammar, the 1534, the Deutsche Grammatica von Valentin Ickelsamer. In fact, we do have some grammars antedating this book. And for the 16th century, we have about 30 relevant titles by more than 20 authors. We do have a large textual diversity because these authors have different backgrounds, and I will just be showing to you some of these backgrounds. In fact, the first sources we have for the German language date back to the 15th century. So here's another overview that I made myself, where you can have the types of grammars and dictionaries and also other types of linguistic treatises on the German languages from the 15th to the 17th century. That's the green arrow. And then underlined in red, you have the external language history factors, or some of them, which are important to understand why these text genres that are the black arrows have been produced at a given point in time. And if we have a look, we see that some of the factors from the red underlined text, like the influence of the Latin grammar, still are active in the 17th century and even in the 18th and to the 21st century, as others like maybe the humanism strategies of making prints with some punctuation treatises have disappeared in the course of time. Today, you do not buy a book, I don't know, a novel, and then have a little a punctuation treatise before you start reading your novel. That's not a practice anymore. So I would like to invite you to go with me through time, and I just, I've chosen a few examples just to give you, yes, a little bit an idea of how, heterogeneous on one hand these genres are, but also how wonderfully different they are, and what you can do with all these texts, and what questions can be asked to the different types of grammatical treatises from the 15th to the 17th century. So this will be a tour de force, and I've chosen a few so that you can just get a first idea. So let's start with the 15th and 17th century, where in red you can see the big, societal events that will be influencing the written culture, like humanism, printing, influence of the Latin grammar, the Counter-Reformation and the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and the teaching of German as a foreign language. And in the genres we have translations, we have texts written by professional writers, for example, for chancelleries, how to write letters and in a correct way with all the titling of the people you are writing to, and how to begin a letter, how to close it, what to write in the middle. Then you have the treatises written by schoolmasters, who are the people, in fact, teaching our little boy outside the tower to get into the tower and to make him able to read and write in the mother tongue, and then in order also to get into the Latin tower. But those are also the people that want to teach and write to people who want to read the Bible for themselves and do not want especially to get into a Latin tower, but are just living in the town and wanted to get to read and write for themselves. And in the 16th century, we have the first full grammars and also dictionaries with grammars in them. So I'll just show you a few of these sources. For the 15th century, we do have a very interesting manuscript. It's a fragment, in fact, written by Christoph Huber. It's not our Christoph Huber, Tübingen, Henrike that we still know. It's a Christoph Huber who wrote in 15th century, and he wrote a text as a schoolmaster, and we have a few notes from him. so that we can have an insight in how he was teaching children to read and write. And he is an adept of the acrophonetic method. As you can see, those little images that are in the illustration on the left side. So the acrophonetic method is a method where you the letters of an alphabet are represented by objects beginning with the respective sound. So you can see the F, and the F stands for falcon, or Falke, and for the other images we can all have a little, riddle. What is meaning? You see the hanging for the H, and the I for the eagle, which begins with I in German. And so you have the this acrophonetic method that we can see. It's a manuscript, so you see that it's also in the manuscript culture. We have some traces of language and grammar teaching of the German language. Here an example of a humanist translation made by Niklas von Wiele. And here we see an example of the early printing of the 15th century, where in the preface we have a punctuation rules which tells us how to read this text. And if you read the punctuation rules, you get a clue that the practice of reading these texts is probably an oral practice. It's not the practice of silent reading, because the punctuation rules, they give the tact, the pauses that should be made when you read this translation. So besides the materiality that we do have the first traces of the German grammar, and also here punctuation, but he also has other grammatical writing rules. We have the fact that we have them in the first prints of the time in the 15th century. And so that this is something that is generally or linked to the printing practice also, the idea of giving grammatical advice or orthographical advice and rules in these first prints of the 15th century. And for the 16th century, I brought you, of course, the Orthographia von Fabian Frank, who was a professional writer and also in a chancellery. And Frank is interesting because he, as one of the very early linguists, he has a concept, he formulates a concept of an overarching linguistic standard, so that the German language is something that should be conceived as something virtual, and he names best practice examples like the Chancellery of Maximilian, the printer Johann Schönsberger in Augsburg, and of course Martin Luther, who of course 1531 was still alive at that time. So we have a confessionalization of grammar writing, which goes back to the living times of Martin Luther. And this is something that is very interesting, that we have a link to confession and grammar, which goes back to the 16th century. And in fact, if you're wondering why this woodcut is on the title, we might have a look at it. It looks pretty, yes, brutal. We have the beheading of St. John, and Orthographia Deutsch, lernt recht buchstäbig Deutsch schreiben, and if you don't do this, you might be beheaded. This is one of the big traps of interpreting illustrations in the 16th century. Of course, this is not the case, and one should be aware of what we do with pictures when we find them in old prints. So, in fact, this is a woodcut which was quite expensive. It is made by Lucas Cranach the elder, and the printer, he just wanted to amortize his investment, and he did in fact use this woodcut for all other titles also in his press at that time and during these years. So there's I think 10 or 15 books that have been published with the same woodcut, and the only thing that has been changed is in the middle part where you put in the title. So this is a very interesting also insight in the practice of printing in the 16th century. But of course you have a link, you have a theological link to what is inside, and it is also a sign that grammar or orthography is something that is confessionally embedded in the society of that time. Here you have the Valentin Ickelsammer's Deutsche Grammatica, which is of course the one that also Sylvain Auroux had in mind when he was doing his chart with the grammatization of the vernaculars in the Renaissance. And Ickelsammer is also somebody that you have to read in the Reformation context. And he's famous also for something else, because he is considered as the father of modern phonetics. He has very, very interesting and very, very detailed descriptions of the different sounds of the German language, which he really does in a very, very interesting way without knowing an alphabet of the phonetic association or something like that. He does this in the way of the 16th century, but he is really very, very accurate in what he does. And he is also the founder of a method of reading or alphabetization, which is called the Lautiermethode, and so that you don't, and not the syllabier method, that you don't say A, B, C, D, but you say B, D, S, etc., so that the children will be learning the letters of the alphabet with their phonetic value and not with their syllables or their names. So that's something that's still practiced today, and he is considered the father also of this method. And in the 16th century, of course, we have the first full grammars of German. There are 3 of them, and I just chosen one. Besides Albert Oehlinger's and Laurentius Albertus grammar, we have the grammar of Johannes Claius, Grammatica Germanica Lingue. And as you already see from the title and inside, not always, the title is not always a guarant for the language inside, but inside, you see that these grammar and the other 2 also are written in Latin. So we have other premises. These grammars are not meant to be used by people who do not know Latin. And all of these grammars have a background as an instrument for teaching German as a foreign language. So that's also interesting to see. And in using Latin, not only as a description language, we also see how the grammar of the German language will be forged on the pattern of the Latin language, and how this has been imprinted in our brains until today. With Claius, we also have the idea that a good language must have as many cases as one of the holy languages, in this case Latin. And so of course he will be building a vocative, o du Rock, o du Engel, and o du Buch, and o du Schwein, and an ablative also von dem Rocke und von den Engeln, in order to prove that the German language will have as many case markers or case positions as the Holy Latin language. You already have had the lecture on Purism, and of course it is also a sort of explanation and justification narrative that the German language is as good as all the other languages, especially the 3 holy languages, Greek, Latin, and Hebraic. So we have to prove this by building grammars that have exactly the same type of grammatical categories, and also the filling of these categories has to be at least as quantitatively, at least, as equal to these other patterns. And of course, the Latin language plays a big role here too. And then just to show one example of dictionaries coming up at that time, it's also in the context of foreign language teaching, or also the context of traveling through Europe. We must think about the Grand Tour who is coming up, the people, the wealthy people, the noble people, but also the wealthy merchant and other wealthy people leaving their hometowns and going to Italy and France, etc. And so you need dictionaries, multilingual dictionaries, and the interesting dictionaries made by Levinus Hulsius is that they are customizable. You can say what do you want, in this case French and German, and then you can say I would like a German grammar or a French grammar to go with it, and they will be binding, giving you the pages, and then you can make a binding by yourself. This is of course a bibliographical horror today for catalogizing these in libraries, because when I was working on the bibliography of the German grammars of the 15th and 16th century, every time I had a copy of Hulsius, it looked different. And in the 17th and also because the editions are, and then at the end he has Latin, German, French, Italian, and then you can choose the grammars you need. And so every book is an individual. So this is the concept of biography of the book. It really could be exercised in these types of dictionaries. It would be also a nice object of research for a master's thesis or something like that. So Objektbiografie, and every piece is an individual piece. And then we have the link to the manuscript culture, which of course every piece is unique. So we'll be coming to the 17th century, and there is the same, this is the same chart I've made for you for the 17th century. And of course, for the 17th century, coming as new factors is the Baroque state of mind, of course, with the Baroque art history, but also the Baroque literature and the Baroque society. And then, of course, the creation of language society on the basis of the Italian Accademia della Crusca, which had already been founded in the 16th century, and the Purism debates that are becoming more virulent. They were already there in the 15th and 16th century, but we have a more virulent and a more theory-based debate in Purism in the 17th century, which is linked also to the philosophy of language and to the way the German language is conceived in its role and its in relation to the Latin and Latin language, for example, but also in its relation to other languages as Italian and French, especially on the background of the 30 Years' War, which of course will give certain impulses in the narratives why German would be better than French or Italian, for example, etc. So let's have a look at some of these texts, and you will see I've again chosen examples with illustrations, which can be more or less nicely done. As Samuel Butschke's Hochdeutsche Kanzlei. Samuel Butschke was a very interesting, a little bit weird person, and he had also a mission of orthography reform, and he had a very particular way of writing, and he did epistolary treatises with orthographic treatises where he would be really keen on reforming German orthography, which is interesting in its on its own also. But he has also written the Venus Kanzlei with love letters, which are very long. It's a very thick book, but where he also stresses the fact that you have to write correctly in order to communicate correctly. And here, in the context of the not only reforms in language, but also in the didactical reforms that are made in the 17th century. I just want to name Wolfgang Radke and his reforms that will be stressing the fact that children will have to learn in their mother tongue. There will be also reform of the terminology. We'll have German words for the grammatical categories, etc. Here we have one example of such a product in this philosophy of a didactic reform, which is really modern. It's Tilman Olearius' Deutsche Sprachkunst. Tilman Olearius writes in his prefaces that there's nothing so dull and boring than children sitting in a class, looking at their papers, having nothing to say, and having to listen to a teacher who will be monologuizing and be boring them until they just fall asleep, and that this had to be ended, and that you should be making new concepts of teaching grammar to children. And this is what he did in his German grammar, Deutsche Sprachkunst, which is in fact also a Latin grammar. This is interesting. And he invented playing cards, where the pupil would be playing with the cards in order to learn the cases of the German nouns or the tenses of the German verb. Ich werde tun, and then you have this memotechnical method of memorizing the tenses, and you see underneath the Latin forms, so that in a second possibility you would be able to learn Latin in a playful way, and this is not easy. All of us who had Latin at school know that this could be a real challenge. And the interesting thing about this is that if we have a look at the materiality of the book, this book, it is a chance that we have one example or one piece of this book which is complete, because in able to teach this method, you have to destroy the book. You have to cut out the pages and make playing cards of the book. So this is very interesting, and it's really a sign that there are very, very new methods coming up in the 17th century. Unfortunately, they have been forgotten in the 18th century and the rationalist way of teaching then in the schools. And then I just took this one because I like it, because it's a little bit weird. We have a Neue Hochdeutsche Donat. Donat is the term for grammar. So you see the Latin tradition. And Isaac Perlman, he was from Berlin, and he wrote a grammar where he was trying to teach the German grammar with the moon phases. And so the declensions, if they're full moon, you have full declension, etc. And then you have these moon signs in the paradigms in order to make the things interesting. And on the other hand, he just tried to develop a method where, well, phenomenons of nature would be bound to phenomenons of grammar, which also is an interesting philosophical topic. It might be interesting to have a closer look at. Has been really analyzed until now. And then, of course, we cannot go past Justus Georg Schottelius, who was in Wolfenbüttel, and his ausführliche Arbeit von der deutschen Hauptsprache. Here we have the real scholarly scientific approach. Schottelius was in fact, he was not a grammarian per se from his formation. He studied law, and he is one of the big players in the Baroque language societies, and he is one of the persons who really start reflecting on the German language from a scientific point of view, documenting the language and also making a theory about what language is. And he is one of the first ones to really write down that the aim of a grammarian and the job of a grammarian is not to prescribe language rules, but to describe a virtual language that is an overarching system over the dialects of German. So he has a conception of the language of the German standardized language, not as being spoken somewhere in the German language landscape, for example, in the East Middle German parts. Those were other people thinking that this would be the case, but he was the person saying, no, the German language system is a virtual system. It is lingua germanica ipse. It is in per se a virtual system, and that's the big endeavor of grammarians to describe this system. So I could say a lot about this title page on the right that you would see. I published about it. It's not only a linguistic program. You see these two columns. You see on the, of course, the emblematic messages. You have the palm tree of the fruchtbringende Gesellschaft on the left. On the right, you have Schottelius emblem. Then you have, of course, the columns that are Hercules columns, and they have to be placed in the time the political times of the Habsburg regime, whereas there's a unifying tendency. So there's also a political message to this, and all these people standing around the columns, they are wearing different clothes coming from different regions, and the overarching instrument for reunifying all these people coming from different regions is that what is hung between the two columns, it is the German language. So you have a political message in this image too. So here you have the printed title, Deutsche Hauptsprache. It is a book that is a very thick book. It has 1,466 pages, not including the index. And you have, besides the concept of Spracharbeit, you have to work on the language, and this language is a virtual entity. It overarches regional languages and dialects. You have an encyclopedic interest, a scientific interest. He quotes and cites, and he documents the language system of the German language, especially the word formation. You have pages and pages of word formation with lists of word formation items, etc. So it's really one of the big scientific publications of the 17th century. And one of his mates in the Fruchtbringende Gesellschaft, Georg Philipp Haasdorfer, who was a very rich merchant, or he was a rich person coming from Nuremberg. He was a patrizier. He was also a member of the Fruchtbringende Gesellschaft. He published also, he was the cultural broker between Germany and Italy, besides doing a lot of grammar treatises on the German language. And he also is one of those people who published in Latin on the German language, just showing that this is a scientific topic, not only a topic of a school topic, etc. And in this picture, you again see, and this is the interesting thing about grammars, is that they have titles and they have woodcuts, and afterwards then these types of titles where you have a metaphorical language which is built on building, and the grammarian is seen as an architect, as a language builder, and you see people helping him to build these language. And this, of course, is not new. The idea that grammar is the fundament, we saw in the beginning, is the source of all other arts, but grammar is also the fundament of everything, of thinking, of science, and of communication between people in society. And this is an idea that has already been formulated by Quintilian and by Cassiodore. And of course, this is something that these grammarians of the 17th century will be taking to undermine their idea that the language system is something virtual, and that has to be built and constructed per analogy through the person doing this in a scientific way. So this is interesting. You see the town in the background, and the tower is not a tower of knowledge anymore, the building on the right, it is the grammar. And there's another source of metaphor in the 17th century language thinking is the vegetable metaphor of the tree, the language tree, and this is the title of a dictionary, Kaspar Stieler's dictionary, der deutschen Sprache Stammbaum und Fortwachs, where we can see, and this is a very interesting title, illustration, because the whole philosophy of the fruchtbringende Gesellschaft has been put into this title. We have a monolingual dictionary that is written in the philosophy of Schottelius and the fruchtbringende Gesellschaft. It's not alphabetical, but it is ordered with the Stammwörter, and it has a grammar and theoretical background, and it also has a grammar inside. But what we see is also the conviction that the German language is of an old age. It is Adamic. It is also paradise. It comes from paradise. We have this origin from paradise, and we have the Purism and word formation philosophy in Nietzsche also. We have the language tree, and this tree has many branches. That's the tree of the German language. The many branches going into the soil, giving new branches, and you have lots of leaves, and these leaves are the words of the language, of the German language, and these leaves can be combined to millions and millions of new words, and then the forest of the German language will be growing from this tree. And of course we have, and this is why I put one of the animals in color in blue. It comes from paradise, and hence all these cute animals populate this forest, and it's not because they didn't like squirrels or rabbits. It's just to show that these language has a origin that is from paradise. So we have paradisical animals in there too. So this is really an interesting point of view. It's the language tree that we already have from the fruchtbringende Gesellschaft with the palm tree, etc. And it is always becoming this language metaphor of the growth of nature. And here we have Schottelius explaining what he means with this language tree. Ein jedes standfestes Gebäude beruht auf seinen unbeweglichen, wohlbefällten Gründen, also einer jeglichen Sprache Kunstgebäude, das ist das Virtual System, besteht gründlich in ihren ursprünglichen natürlichen Stammwörtern, welche als stets saftvolle Wurzeln den ganzen Sprachbaum durchfeuchten, dessen Sprösslein, Ast und aderreiche Zweige in schönster Reinlichkeit, steter Gewissheit und unergründender Mannigfaltigkeit räumlich und hoch ausbreiten lassen, nachdem auch eine Sprache an solchen Stammwörtern kräftig und wurzelreich ist, kann sie auch schöne, herrliche und vielfältige Früchte geben, nicht anders wie ein Baum nach dem saftigen Standen seiner ausgebreiteten Wurzeln die Früchte reich oder kärglich wachsen lässet. This is taken from Schottelius' work. Stieler's dictionary, a few years later, will be putting this into print, the idea of these leaves, these words. So the tree, the language tree will be accompanying all these prints of the 17th century, which are produced in the framework of the fruchtbringende Gesellschaft. Here you see Johannes Berlin's Hochdeutsche Rechtschreibung, where he shows us that orthography is something also that has to be made in a virtual way, and that Ursachen, the analogy, the scientific approach, the looking at the rules of a language are more important, hence they are a block. You see the Grammatica here also personified with her left foot on a block where Ursachen is written on it, and Gebrauch is the use of the people in the different landscapes, and that's a problematical factor, because it's just like a ball that rolls away when you tip it from your feet, and that's on the right side of her, the right foot. You see Gebrauch in this in this ball with the wings on it, so that it will be just going away and you will not be catching it anymore. So, and on the left, in the left hand, she holds, of course, the alphabet. So just think about the Grammatica we saw in the 1503 Reich woodcut, and on the right hand, it's the title of the book. In front, you have trees, and in the back, you have the palm tree of the fruchtbringende Gesellschaft. It's the emblem of this language society. Here you see both of them side by side. Right, the fruchtbringende Gesellschaft in the emblem book, alles zu nutzen, and left the grammar, the orthography treatise of Johannes Berlin with the palm tree in the background. So this is also legitimization of the book in this state of mind of the fruchtbringenden Gesellschaft. Gesellschaft. And as I'm coming slowly to the end of my presentation, I just wanted to show you some other facet of Hausdorff's yes, I don't know, as a poly writer. He's really some universal writer. He did lots of things, but he also did conversational books, the Frauenzimmer Gesprächsspiele, conversational games for ladies, where the language and language play and also orthography and grammar have a really, really big role. And we are intramuros now. We're not only intramuros in the city, but we are intramuros in a townhouse. And you see the people talking about funny and intelligent things and doing conversation, of course, in the German language, in a very elaborate form of language where language play and language reflection have a very, very big role to play. And this is very interesting because it's part of a state of mind, not only of language, but Hausdorff also did a cutting book, how to cut pieces of meat. And of course, there in this, and how to fold serviettes and do buffets and things like that. And in this book, you can also have parts of conversation and grammars, because it's part of a whole state of mind, of a way to live and a way to be. So at the end, I would just like to have a look again at our Grammatica in Georg Reich with her tower on in the right hand of the on the left picture, and she's and the things that we've been saying for the beginning of the 16th century. What has happened now in the 17th century? We see a tower, but it's an obelisk, and it's but everything has moved inside, and the female Grammatica has disappeared, and in her place you have in the right part of the right illustration of Georg Schottelius' Anleitung zur Rechtschreibung, an architect, a male architect, a grammarian who is building his language knowledge and his knowledge not outside of the town but inside of the town. And of course we have the tree in the background, the tree of the language, who is central to the idea that the German language is something natural and something eternal also. So I do think it is important to see how images and pictures in grammars do reflect the state of mind of how grammar is conceived and what the role and functions of grammars are, and who are the recipients of these works. So at the end, I would like to talk about further research with you, and I just brought two examples of interesting projects that one might tackle, or that we are tackling for the moment. One project is already in the making. It's called Parallelogramm, and it's the digital network of vernacular grammars in Renaissance and early modern Europe, where we're trying to build such a network. Most of these grammars are already digitized in the libraries of Europe. And with the Trier Center for Digital Humanities, we're planning a network, a platform where we can also look at the intertextual interwovenness of these grammars, especially also with regard to the Latin grammars of the time, but also for multilingual grammars, and also the big topics that are circulating through Europe beyond linguistic and political frontiers, because we should not be forgetting that the frontiers of a language are not political frontiers, and people are per se in Europe multilingual people, and have already always been, and we still always are, which is a great luck that we have living in Europe. And one of the things that I really discovered when working on these 35 years of the grammars is that treatises, they tend to be used. If they're in the libraries, it might be that they have never left the library as a library copy, but many copies in the libraries did have a life before. And in the idea of a biography of the object biography, which is an ethnological concept, it might be interesting to look at traces in grammars. And this is an example of a private copy of a grammar book of the 18th or 17th century, I can't remember, of my own private collection, where you can see how, well, maybe people were, or pupils were also bored about having to work with this grammar, but also leaving traces also inside, and you can discover how grammars are used by the people at that time. So that would be a nice thing to do and collect annotations in grammars. So I'm at the end of my talk now. I hope I haven't been too long. And here you have some literature just to finish it up. So thank you very much.
Many thanks. Absolutely fascinating, resonating on so many levels with topics I've been doing, but also we've been looking at across the series. I'll hand over directly to Louise and Caroline. And Louise, if you want to ask a question first before I burst into all my questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and especially for the many illustrations of how grammars were used during the centuries, which was really, really interesting, especially that they were customized dictionaries and grammars, which I think is a great concept. My question is actually about, I mean, you showed very well that the grammar German grammars are mainly based on the Latin grammars, and that this tradition is still alive today. And my question is, with the change from normative to descriptive grammars, which you showed happened with Schottelius, was there also a change in the attitude towards the Latin foundation of grammars? So could the change that the German language was now described instead, or more described than that they prescribed rules, could that be seen as a criticism of this Latin of the foundation of grammars on the Latin grammars?
I do think that this is something that comes up in the 18th century more than in the 16th and 17th century. There are beginnings of a critical attitude to Latin grammar in the reform movements around Wolfgang Radke. But there still is, and this is the interesting thing, there still is a profoundly anchored idea that the way our language is built, system is built on metalinguistic patterns of Latin grammar, the way we describe it, the categories. Until today, in fact, if you look at the tense system of the German language, there is no, it's still the calque of the Latin tense system, the idea that if something has not, that the Latin grammar is giving you the calque. And the description and prescriptive way of doing grammar has not really profoundly been put into relation to this distancing from Latin as a model, as a calque. So this is a very interesting question you are posing there, but I do think that that we still have to wait until the 18th century with Adelung, where these if you want, the liberation of the corset of the Latin grammar will be more effective. So this is something, and Schottelius is still in his way he has this scientific approach, but the real, as Max Hermann Jelinek would be saying, the real shift will be made by Adelung, where he will be very, very consequent in the way to say this is a descriptive job we are making and not a prescriptive one. And this is something that's very late in the 18th century.
Thank you. Caroline?
Yeah, I'm actually tempted to ask two questions because I really enjoyed the talk. Many thanks again. I mean, I'm an art historian myself, so I'm very grateful that you showed some images. I wondered about the iconographic tradition. So you mainly elaborated on the personification of the grammatiker and depicting the grammarian as an architect. Are there more traditions, and how does it go on after the 17th century? And my second question, I know this is against the rule, but I couldn't make up my mind which question to ask. The second question would be about the customized multilingual dictionaries. Has there been any quantitative analysis on which combination is more common or less common, and what could we learn from it? And how would that change over time? That would be my two questions to go with. I'm very sorry, Henrike, but I couldn't make a decision.
Oh, I'm fine with two questions, and let's break the rules. It's yes, the iconographic tradition. In fact, this topic I've been working on since about 15 years now with art historians in Paris. In fact, and I've presented the topic of the iconographic tradition in grammars in treatises in Paris at the École pratique des hautes études à l'Institut national des Histoire de l'art. And I've been talking to students about this, and it's interesting to say, well, in the 18th century, alas, we have less iconographic materials, and the two big iconographical trends I have made and I've published on is in fact the architectural metaphor. You can also explain this with the metaphor theory of Leboff and Lekov, etc. You can say and why this is the case, because grammar has to be something stable. So this is the architecture, and then you have, of course, the vegetable metaphors. And in the 17th century, in the beginning of the 18th century, there's a very interesting other domain of the vegetable metaphoric is the garden metaphoric, the English versus the French garden. And then we do have title pages where the garden plays a role, and the garden that has to be well planned and well described and not wild and etc. So this is one of the other topics that are playing a role. And of course, I've been working on anthropomorph alphabets, and there we have, of course, the illustration in the idea of the acrophonetic type, etc. And all these iconographic traditions are part of this joint project, or this joint project with the art historians in Paris with Sabine Frommel, and I've published a few of these articles. I could send them to you. It's a very interesting thing, but once again, I would think it would be interesting to look at the other treatises like rhetorics and logic, etc., and have a look of how this forms in whole. And Georg Philipp Haasdorfer, it would be really good to have a look at all the illustrations and iconographic material in his work, because he has published a lot and he has worked a lot with illustrations, which of course the printer he was working with was the same one that was working for the art treatises at that time. So there is a lot of know-how. And up to the customized multilingual dictionaries, there's no work being done in this point, because you would have to go to each copy and then start looking at them and seeing where are the grammars missing and where are the grammars in there. I've collected a few myself, and I was always a little bit disappointed with the German-French ones, because the German grammar was missing and the French grammar was in there. So it is also a symptom or a sign of the importance of the French language in the 16th and 17th century, that people were more willing to learn French and Italian, for example, of course, because of the cultural situation and these countries being prestigious. And I have to mention Haasdorfer once more, the big cultural broker between Italy and Germany at that time, and that there is a sign that these other languages are tended to be learned and not the German language. But as I say, this is only an impression because no, this work still has to be done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for these really interesting questions also.
It's a perfect question to stop the official part with, because it really links to projects that also I hope our students will be able to pick up. So Biografien des Buches is something we've been doing a lot, and one copy that was intensely researched last year was a singular copy of an edition of Comenius Januar, which morphed in similar ways across Europe. And it's good that there's still a lot to discover. So
I just noticed one thing.